BeTheTalk, episode 372, featuring Eileen Scully. Welcome to BeTheTalk. We go behind the talk 7 days a week for tips and techniques to help you change the world. I'm Nathan Eckel, and a talker myself. I'm interviewing others who change the world with their talk. You can too, even if you've never given a talk before. Let's get started with today's show. We are live with Eileen Scully. Eileen, are you ready to talk?
I was born ready to talk, Nathan.
Eileen Scully is a TEDx speaker, founder of the Rising Tides, and committed to the success of women at work. She's the author of In the Company of Men book, which you can find in thecompanyofmen.com. It was written in 2019, and she is incessantly curious. Eileen Scully, welcome to the talk.
Thank you, Nathan.
Your talk is called How Women Can Succeed in a World Built Without Them. And I got to be honest, as a man, I watch talks like this and I have a choice. I have a choice to kind of run away and not listen and not lean in, or I can really engage. So I'm glad I engaged, because pretty much every interview that we've done in the entire series of interviews, of which you're the final interview, it's been about diversity. It's been inclusion. And I've learned a lot from you in this episode. I know I will, as well as everyone else. And in terms of your talk, one of your real themes is the need to hold companies accountable for the lack of diversity, not just in the population, but right up there in the top, the leadership diversity. And it's really about performance. And it is also about just being brave. And you mentioned a performance artist that basically kind of goes out in public, stripped down to the bare, not the barest of essentials, but the bare close, legal, yeah. the legal bare essentials, and basically went out there and allowed people to write messages on her body, and just kind of as almost like a metaphor for the kind of bravery that it's taken for women to rise and say the kinds of things that you said in your talk. So, Eileen, that was a little bit of an introduction. Please take us behind the talk.
Yeah, so I think great summary. Instead of, I have issues with Sheryl Sandberg and leaning in, because that puts the entire onus on each of us for our own success or failure, without acknowledging that there are systems and structures in place that, intentionally or not, work against women in the workplace. So my research around the Fortune 50 companies and exposing the lack of women on the very top levels, the lack of women on their boards, the lack of women on their executive leadership, and in particular, the lack of women of color in those positions, was meant to say, let's take a look at this from a couple different perspectives. We are shareholders, many of us, in these Fortune 50 companies. We are potential employees of many of these companies, and we are consumers of many of the products that these companies produce. Each of those three constituencies obviously have overlap, but they're powerful. And we, as each of those representations, can demand better from those companies. One of the ones that I talk about in a very positive light is General Motors. General Motors has Mary Barra. She is their CEO. She is also the chair of their board. She, in the time that I was producing this research, she appointed a 39-year-old woman of Indian descent as their CFO. So if you look at companies that are putting putting women in positions of power and influence, General Motors is an outstanding example of that, in an industry, manufacturing, that is incredibly male-dominated and very old school. So I give them a huge amount of credit. One of the other things for me that's remarkable is in the Fortune 500 companies, there are only 2 of them that have a woman CEO and a woman CFO. That's got to change.
This is a little bit left field, because it deals with the topic of harassment and all of that. But I'm watching lately the Gretchen Carlson interviews, I think on Netflix or so, where she goes to, I think, the Fairfax Fire Department that had a female fire chief or department head of some sort. And it really exposes the kind of institutionalized old boys network that you're kind of talking about. And we're not talking about sexual harassment or anything like that here, but it did kind of give me a window into kind of the power dynamics and the policy versus the actual meaningful implementation of that. When you see something like that, when you see a documentary or when you hear the story, what do you think about, and how do you think about that in terms of the potential that corporations and organizations lose when we don't have enough diversity, and in terms of the products that could be better designed, better marketed, better resonated? What's your take on all of that, Eileen?
So I think that there are a couple elements to that, but sexual harassment in the workplace can never be completely removed from the experience of being a woman in the workplace, right? It's getting better, but it's still not anywhere near where it needs to be. I like to challenge the companies that I work with to make sexism as uncool as racism and homophobia are in the workplace right now. There are certain things you would never say about another person's race in the way that you would make a comment about someone's gender or their sexuality. And we have to move to that place and make it a truly equal opportunity and experience for everyone.
What would you say? And I'm going to just be candid here. I grew up in a very rural environment. I grew up in the 80s, and it seems like the more connected and kind of suburban or urbanized we are, the more we can kind of understand what's appropriate, what's not appropriate. I mean, this almost sounds a little silly of a question because it's like, who isn't connected, who isn't wired? But we all know there are some people that just aren't as socialized. I'll just say that in some way. So if you're someone who's listening to this, or someone who's newer to the workforce, or maybe you had a certain upbringing, what would be your advice to how they can meaningfully engage in work and learn the appropriate things to do, maybe not do, without being untrue to maybe some of the heritage or the values or identity that they have growing up? I hope that wasn't too ridiculously worded, but I want to kind of get at the heart of helping people to be able to all contribute across the board without alienating anyone or resisting what we're all trying to do, which is just to be more productive and more human and more empathetic to one another. So a lot of this is detailed in my book, where I take different chapters and I highlight remarkable women that are having extraordinary success in very male spaces, but they're also widening that path for other people. Okay. So they're not just saying, I did something great, now you have to figure it out on your own. They're saying, I've achieved this with help and support and advocacy, and they're extending that and growing that for other people. To directly answer your question, I will say that we have many instances, unfortunately, way too many for me to detail here, of white men from very privileged institutions of higher learning with advanced degrees who are accused of sexual assault and harassment at the same levels of people who don't have that point of privilege. So there's a shared responsibility, back to what I was saying earlier, for everyone to be able to examine their own internal biases. What are those dialogues they have? Many of these behaviors are rooted in personal insecurities. So if you're self-aware enough to look inside and see those things and understand that, it then becomes your job to reach out to people that are outside of your immediate circle, people who look and pray and love like you, and bring them into a wider acceptance. That's going to change the game. I have research from my consulting work that shows, I call them 10% resistors. Actually, it's more like 20%. And then another 20% on the other side of the bell curve that are the advocates.
And I challenge people to look at what's that 10% of people that are in that middle section that they can influence towards advocacy. And that is a remarkable way to change culture. It's individual responsibility.
Well, we've been enjoying this conversation with Eileen Scully. Her talk is called How Women Can Succeed in a World Built Without Them. And we're going to pivot right over in just a moment over to the Blitz Round. And we're back with Eileen Scully. It is time for the Blitz Round. I'm going to ask Eileen a series of either-or questions related to the preparation and performance of her talk, How Women Can Succeed in a World Built Without Them. Eileen, are you ready?
Let's go.
Were you invited to speak or did you apply?
I was invited to speak.
Did you memorize, did you improvise, or did you blend your talk?
I would say I did both. I probably over-rehearsed. I did my talk 10 times a day for the 30 days prior, just to be sure that I was comfortable and familiar not only with the material, but with the flow and the sequence. And that gave me a lot of confidence to be able to make modifications on the fly.
What is a tip or a tool or a technique that helped you?
I'm not a visual learner. I'm a audio learner. Mm-hmm. So I recorded myself, I should say. I'm showing my age. I recorded myself, right? Recorded myself doing my talk and then had it on my phone. And when I was in the car, I would play it and listen to it over and over again. So
Talk Universe, I'm a big fan of that technique. And this is about Eileen, not me, but I will say that's what I did in a hyper batched fashion on the way to my TEDx audition. It's amazing the power of, dictating and then listening to what you said, maybe at an accelerated rate to be able to get new thoughts and ideas. I love it. What was the most painful part of your talk, Eileen, that you had to cut out for time?
It probably wasn't. It's too much research. I'm a data research wonk, and my talk was in Tunisia. So it's a very different audience than the one that I'm generally accustomed to here. So I had to not only understand a culture that was very different from mine, but I had to be able to modify my message. And when I look back on it, I still think I could have done better to bring the message to Tunisia instead of bringing my message and expecting the Tunisian audience to relate to it.
So Tunisia, so that's not sub-Saharan Africa. That's like Saharan Africa.
That's Northern Africa.
Yeah. So Northern Africa. I've been to Eastern Africa myself, but that's Northern Africa. What was it like giving a strong, compelling message? I mean, you don't mince words on your talk. And you're delivering it in Tunisia. It's at a TED Talk, but you're doing this within a culture that may not be the most open or inclusive. So correct me if I'm wrong, but what was that like?
So it was fascinating, and I was scared to death that I was going to deliver a message that wouldn't land. The two brothers who sponsored the TED Talk in Tunisia really want to bring the world to Tunisia, and that's why they did this. And they wanted to elevate the perception of not only Tunisia, but their city, Sfax, within Tunisia as an innovation center. Tunisia was the country that sparked the Arab Spring. And I know a lot of Americans remember Egypt and what happened in Egypt, but that all started in Tunisia.
I didn't know that.
And a lot of people don't.
I would have said Cairo and Egypt, and that's where it all started.
Right. So Tunisia has a lot of pride in who they are and where they've come in a few short years. 1 month before my TED Talk, their capital city, which is Tunis, elected their first female mayor. So it's electric. Tunisia is doing incredible things, investing in women's education, employment, really helping women excel and expand and really contribute widely to the economy.
Wow. So, this is still the Blitz round, but I'm learning stuff every day right here. My last question, Eileen, you caught me off guard right there. Congratulations. My last question. What was the most unexpected, strange, or just plain weird thing that happened during or right before your talk?
Can I give you two?
Sure.
Okay. The first one is this particular talk that I did. When I usually do it in a modified way for my corporate clients, my opening line says that it took me until my 20s to learn that the world was made by and for white, straight men. That line for me in Tunisia was highly controversial because it is still illegal to be homosexual in Tunisia. I mentioned the brothers who sponsored the conference. We had a dinner the night before after the tech rehearsal. And I said, they told me they loved how I started at the tech rehearsal and I left out straight. And I said to them, well, just so you know, this is how I normally do it. And they said, do it. They said, we want to make people think, we want to challenge what people think of who they are. And so I did. And I was a little nervous going out there and saying it, but I knew I had their support and their endorsement. So, and the other thing that happened was I was the last person on the agenda, which is great because you get to land the whole conference and leave people on a high note, right? But it put a lot of responsibility on me too. The woman who spoke before me, this lovely, lovely woman, went way over her time. And so I had been rehearsing. I locked myself in a room and I knew what I was doing and I was ready and I was standing backstage. I got wired up and then it was standing there for 12 minutes of the longest 12 minutes of my life. And I've been in labor. So
that's overtime. Talk Universe.
Yes.
When you're going over by 12 minutes, that's over.
Right. She was great. And she was nervous. It was her first talk. She did a phenomenal job. But for me backstage, I was ready to go. And I had all that momentum and that energy and I had to just quell it down and wait. So I was a closer as well. What's your advice for future closers out there? Again, always be prepared to modify your message. My talk has a particularly strong ending that the organizers had no idea when they put me last on the agenda. But it allowed me, again, when you see how I opened the talk, I really opened strong and very relevant to that Tunisian audience. And they responded very, very strongly to it. So be able to modify and know who your audience is the most important piece of advice.
We're enjoying the Blitz Round with Eileen Scully. Her talk is called How Women Can Succeed in a World Built Without Them. You can find out more. You can check out the talk at our show notes page at BeTheTalk.com. You can also see a link to the talk as well as get a link to connect with Eileen at therisingtides.com as well as inthecompanyofmenbook.com. And we'll be right back with Eileen Scully's final word of advice. And we're back with Eileen Scully. It's time for the final word of advice.
Yeah, I would say know your audience. Know exactly who is going to be as much as you possibly can. Know who is going to be sitting in front of you and allow yourself to speak to them. Get off script a little bit and they will remember you and they will relate to you, and just smile and pause the whole time you're giving the talk. Don't be afraid to smile.
Eileen Scully, thank you so much for coming on the talk today and sharing your wisdom with Talk Universe.
Thanks, Nathan.
Thanks for listening to Be the Talk. For tips and resources to help you change the world, go to BeTheTalk.com. See you tomorrow.